watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, as always, Eugene Perrier, and I am here alongside my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back with you.
Great to be back on with you, Eugene. We have such a great show today. I'm more excited than people who are watching.
I'm glad you're excited. We're going from Nicaragua to the Horn of Africa to critical race theory to COP26 and the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. So there's plenty for you here on the show. So wherever you may be watching, make sure you hit that share button so that whoever is following you can follow us. If you happen to be watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Also hit the bell so you can get the alerts of all the fantastic content we have here at Breakthrough News. But let's just dive right into it, Rania. I want to start here with the just recent past elections in Nicaragua, won by the FSLN, the Sandinista party, and we are very happy to be joined for this conversation by Ben Norton, who's a journalist and assistant editor at The Gray Zone, who was there and is there in Nicaragua. Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on this great program.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, Ben, I guess maybe my first question for you is, there is quite a bit of hue and cry in the press in the United States against the Sandinistas, demonizing their leadership, but it seems like they won a landslide victory there in Nicaragua. What does that say about the difference between the rhetoric and the reality as it concerns the current situation in Nicaragua?
Well, there are so many lies. Frankly, there's just so much fake news, blatant fake news in mainstream corporate media outlets trying to discredit the revolution in Nicaragua and the elections on November 7th. Here you can see the video of people celebrating spontaneously. These are Sandinista supporters. They came out the night of the election, so around like midnight on the night of the 7th, the early morning of the 8th, to celebrate into the very early hours of the morning. And there's so much fake news trying to discredit these Nicaraguans, acting as though they don't exist, acting as though the Sandinista Front is not the vibrant force that it is, acting as though it doesn't have the support of the majority of Nicaraguans. Polls have consistently shown for many months leading up to the election that the Sandinistas have the support of around 2/3 of Nicaraguans. And that's not surprising because the Sandinistas, since they came back to 2007, they have created a system of free universal health care, which is high quality in a very poor country with few resources, free higher education for everyone, great infrastructure programs, jobs programs, public housing, and very cheap housing for people, good quality housing that costs very little. So it's no surprise that the Sandinistas won re-election, but there's been a concerted attempt in foreign corporate media outlets to act as though the elections were supposedly rigged, which is false, that turnout was supposedly low, which is also false, that the opposition was barred from participating, another blatant lie. In fact, at the Gray Zone, I just published an article going through systematically each of the lies spread by the New York Times and other outlets, but specifically the New York Times, whose reporter was not in Nicaragua with us, the other reporters. She was in Mexico. So from Mexico, apparently they think that they have like some it's like telepathic power where they can just figure out what's going on across these multiple borders in Nicaragua, but they weren't actually on the ground. I was on the ground. I went to 4 different electoral sites, 4 different centers. I interviewed voters and I published video of the voters. And frankly, the campaign, the dirty campaign against Nicaragua is nothing more than fake news. I mean, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but that's exactly what it is. It's completely fake. And being here and seeing the flagrant lies in foreign media outlets, it makes you kind of feel crazy almost because what you're seeing on the ground is directly contradicted, but by all of the major media outlets from the New York Times to the Washington Post and beyond.
What do you think is motivating this just unreality in terms of what's going on in Nicaragua? I mean, you listed a number of things that sound, I think most people would think that sounds good, affordable housing, healthcare, all these other pieces. What's behind the demonization, you think?
Well, the narrative used to attack the Sandinista government is that President Daniel Ortega is now entering his 4th term. Remember, this was the same propaganda used against Evo Morales in Bolivia, which was used to carry out a military coup, a far-right military coup in November of 2019, exactly 2 years ago. 2 years ago this week, when Evo Morales won his 4th term of re-election, And there was this campaign saying that Evo Morales in Bolivia was supposedly authoritarian, supposedly he was a dictator, when in reality, he won the election with over half of the vote. That's exactly what's happening here in Nicaragua. Yes, Ortega is entering his fourth term, but that's because he's an extremely popular figure. And in some ways, term limits can be undemocratic if a leader is very popular, as we see right now in Brazil, rather. In Brazil, Lula da Silva is trying to go for his third term, and a lot of Brazilians would rather have Lula da Silva rather than the far-right corrupt candidate, current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who only came to power because Lula da Silva was imprisoned. What we're seeing here is an attempt to meddle blatantly in the internal electoral process of Nicaragua because the US government will not tolerate the Sandinistas in power. That's why in 2018, Washington backed a brutally violent coup attempt here in Nicaragua. I've interviewed loved ones, family members, friends of people, of Sandinistas who were killed, who were tortured by these far-right coup plotters. And what's interesting is that the 2019 coup in Bolivia, it's well known. It got a lot of attention, rightfully, in the global North left, in the international media, because it was so flagrant, it was so clearly racist and violent. The thing is, the blueprint for the 2019 coup in Bolivia that succeeded, what was used a year before here in Nicaragua, but it failed. It failed because the Sandinistas were so popular. It failed because, unlike in Bolivia, where Evo Morales didn't control the military, here, the military is a nationalist, pro-Sandinista military. But the point is that the same violent terrorist tactics used against indigenous people in Bolivia, supporters of the MAS party, the same tactics were used here to terrorize Sandinistas. And people in Nicaragua, they're not dumb. They remember what happened just 3 years ago. They remember the violence sponsored by Washington and Brussels. And that's one of the main reasons the Sandinistas won with such a large margin. They won with 76% of the vote and 65% turnout. The second place right-wing party, the PLC, the Liberal Constitutionalist Party, got 14% of the vote because people are tired of the neoliberal corrupt status quo and they want to continue. And yes, Ortega's in his fourth term, but that doesn't mean he's a dictator. It means he's a very popular leader and people want him back in power again because he's the only leader who has created a system of universal health care, who has created a system of universal education, jobs, housing, and safety in a very dangerous region where El Salvador and Honduras, the neighbors of Nicaragua, have some of the highest murder rates in the world, have gangs, have narco trafficking is a huge problem. Here in Nicaragua, none of those problems exist. And that's why the Sandinistas are so popular. And that's why people keep voting for them. And the right-wing opposition can't win an election. So they tried a violent coup in 2018. It failed. So their only other option left is to try to discredit the elections by saying that they're rigged, which is false, by saying the opposition didn't participate. That's false. There were 5 opposition parties on the ballot alongside Ortega from the Sandinista front. So the only option they have left is to try to discredit the electoral process, exactly what they tried to do in Venezuela, because they're violent coups attempt and they can't win an election freely and fairly.
Yeah, and we should add that, this comes on the heels of a new sanctions package that the US just passed against Nicaragua that's quite harsh and restrictive. And I will just say, like, Anthony Blinken tweeted this out a couple hours ago. He congratulated the president for signing the Renaissance Act, which is the new sanctions against Nicaragua, and said this bill provides the State Department with additional tools to support democracy in Nicaragua. So, I mean, just to add to what you said, what you just said, it's unfortunate because this is definitely going to have a very impact on a country that's already impoverished, such as Nicaragua, to have these kinds of siege-like tactics that we've seen against Cuba and Venezuela.
Yeah, well, it's not a coincidence that Nicaragua was the next country on the list to be targeted by a U.S. economic blockade. Let's not forget that in the Trump administration, it was National Security Advisor John Bolton, a hardcore neoconservative architect of the Iraq War. He infamously declared that Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba were part of the so-called troika of tyranny. Well, the U.S. has already had an illegal criminal blockade against Cuba since the early 1960s. And every year at the United Nations, the entire world, excluding the US and Israel, condemn that illegal blockade. And the US now has a blockade against Venezuela and suffocating sanctions against Venezuela. So it was unfortunately only a matter of time until Nicaragua was next to be targeted for being a member of the Troika of Resistance, against US meddling in the region, the troika of resistance in defense of socialized systems of universal health care and medicine and housing programs, and all of these programs that you can see in the images here. These are Sandinista youth. Most of them are from humble backgrounds, poor and working class families, and they're volunteers and they're activists in the Sandinista front because their lives have been so greatly improved by the Sandinistas. It's exactly the same thing in Venezuela. It's the same thing in Cuba. And people are willing to fight to defend that revolution. So now the US is going to try the tactic it always uses, which is an economic blockade, economic warfare. It's going to try to make the economy scream, as Richard Nixon famously said about the Allende socialist government in Chile. It's the same tactic today. And we've seen in Cuba that it doesn't work in removing the popular government, but it does work in making the people suffer. And that's what unfortunately is going to happen in the next few years. I'll be here reporting. And the very likely outcome is that the Sandinistas are going to continue to gain support as the country is more and more aggressively attacked by Washington and Brussels, and people are going to be squeezed. The economy is really going to hurt, but the Sandinistas have really governed effectively. They also have created a system of food sovereignty, which is extremely important. This is a largely agricultural country, and in the neoliberal era with the US-backed right-wing governments, they imported a lot of food. Well, the Sandinistas, when they came back in 2007, they remembered the experience of the US blockade against Nicaragua in the 80s. They remembered the experience of the terror war that the CIA waged by backing the Contra death squads. They remembered that time, and they learned that one of the most important things that they had to do was increase food production. So now the Sandinistas have attained food sovereignty. Over 95% of the food consumed in Nicaragua is produced here in Nicaragua. So unfortunately, an economic blockade is coming very soon, but the Sandinistas are prepared. They have learned from their experience in the 80s. They have learned from Cuba, and they have learned from Venezuela in the past few years. The Sandinistas are not going to be defeated, but the U.S. is going to just try to make the Nicaraguan people suffer as punishment for continuing to vote for the Sandinistas.
Well, Ben, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I hope everyone checks out your piece and continues to follow your reporting on the ground in Nicaragua on all these important issues as we move forward. But thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me, and keep up all the great work.
Right on. Thank you.
Whew. So from one country to another,
Indeed.
was the same. Before we move on to the next story, I want to remind everyone that you can support our work here at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And of course, since we're live streaming right now, you can throw money in the super chat on YouTube, and we will try to read your comments live should you do that.
Yes, absolutely. John K. also just threw something in there. Shout out to you, noting the student protest there in 2018. Well, anyway, sorry, I'm trying to read it right now, but I can't fully see it. Anyway, John, thanks for the donation. We'll come back to it. Well, we're going to just continue to push forward and move, as you said, from one country to another when we're talking about imperialism and targeting and the manipulation of the reality in terms of trying to determine the outcome. And we're going to go to the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia specifically, where there's been a lot going on, continues to be a lot going on. And we're very honored to be joined as we continue the show by the Ethiopian-American journalist Hermela Aregawi and Bob Schlehuber, peacebuilder and co-host of Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, who's just back from Ethiopia a little earlier this week. Bob, Hermela, thank you so much for being with us here in the show.
Eugene, thank you so much for having me. Rania, hi again.
Hello. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Well, just to jump right in, Hermela, let me ask you a question here, because I think one of the elements that a lot of people have been noting is the one-sidedness of the media coverage. And it seemed interesting to me to note that after, hundreds of thousands of people protest in Ethiopia over the weekend, the hashtag No More campaign takes off on social media. All of a sudden, CNN feels moved to interview an advisor to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. And I'm curious, not so much what you think about the interview, but whether or not you think it portends maybe a slight shift as the sort of self-powered movement of the Ethiopian diaspora and those who are allied with it has exposed so many of the lies by these outlets.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's an accident a year into the war, CNN finally speaks to the press secretary of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, right? And you said the reporting has been one-sided. I think that's being generous. I think what a lot of people forget that maybe don't have strong connections to the country is TPLF does not speak for Tigrayans. The story of Tigrayans that are being killed in war, whose kids are being sent into war, whether because they're being brainwashed or forced, is never told. So it's not even one-sided. It's just one element of one side, and that is a fringe group at this point. And it's not a rebel group that's the underdog that's trying to fight for some rights. It's the old guard. It's a group that was in power for nearly 30 years, right? So the way they even talk about them is as if they're just grassroots movement trying to fight for their survival. So they are it's less than one-sided.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead, Rania.
Well, I was just going to say, on top of all the one-sided media coverage we're seeing, we saw a new front open up in this war in the last couple of weeks, and that is the role of social media companies in actually trying to suppress the very popular view by the majority, what seems the majority of Ethiopians, both inside the country and in the diaspora, speaking out against the TPLF, against this war, against the Western narrative that's full of misinformation. And against, at one point, this hashtag campaign, Hermela, that you were involved in, No More, really went viral. And then you saw Twitter come out and make this decision that they're not going to allow viral hashtags for Ethiopia anymore. Can you just briefly address the unequal reaction by social media companies to the narrative of most Ethiopians?
Yeah, so let's compare what these two opposing hashtags are, right? So hashtag Tigray genocide starts on the same day where the TPLF attacks the country's soldiers. And now when the government fights back, they say this is about genocide of ethnic Tigrayans. What you're saying when you say this is a genocide is you are telling Tigrayans everywhere that Amharan specifically, but the Ethiopian government more broadly is trying to eliminate your ethnicity. You are fighting for your survival. You've got to kill them before they kill you. So if that's not inciting violence, I don't know what is. When you look at the other hashtag no more, it is literally saying hashtag no more war, no more false narratives that feed fear and hate into people, that divide people, that give people reasons to kill their own brethren, that no more U.S. intervention that's supporting armed insurgency. So the idea that Twitter, for at least temporarily, took off trends from Ethiopia because hashtag no more started trending because of may incite violence is absolutely laughable. They didn't take down hashtag Tigray genocide this year. So it looks like the trend is back, but I think part of it is that the pro-TPLF activist camp is very aggressive, as you guys know. So they will mass report accounts. I mean, I don't know what they do with their lives. I don't know if anybody's paying attention to their kids, their parents, their brothers, or their neighborhoods, because they literally spend all this time trying to create this division and feed into the false narrative. So that's part of the problem. I think social media's companies, if they do mean to do well, need to figure out how to not let the bullies that just mass report win over the people that are just trying to do the right thing.
And then, I guess with Bob, you were actually just there on the ground, and there is the narrative of Ethiopians and the viewpoints of many Ethiopians that are being suppressed, are being whitewashed by these big corporate media outlets. So, Bob, you were just in Ethiopia. What was the sense you saw on the ground there?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And one thing to note is just how well regarded Breakthrough News and the reporting Hermela has done in Addis Ababa and across the country. So many people, Rania shared the interview the two of you all did together last week. And then obviously the coverage that the Punch Out and Breakthrough News has done over the last year, people are paying attention to it. It's so vitally important. And while I was there too, I thought a lot about the audiences that Breakthrough News has. And The fact that y'all bring them these stories to connect U.S. imperialism and aggression around the world, to go from Nicaragua, of what Ben was saying, Ben Norton was just saying, just change out Nicaragua for Ethiopia. I mean, the same thing is happening around the world. And if anything, it's needing to connect these different acts of oppression and violence to build international solidarity. So it was a remarkable opportunity to be there in Ethiopia to cover the situation on the ground. And yeah, just the complete erasure of the Amhara and people from the states of Amhara and Afar, and to go to the internally displaced camp that have been set up outside of Bahar Dar in the Amhara state, where Lake Tana is this beautiful city, internationally regarded. The ecology, the geography, the monasteries that are there, completely damaged by COVID in 2 years of a crisis, with now another crisis on top of it, and to have those voices completely blocked out of U.S. media. And these people, they're not stupid people. They're not poor Africans that are presented by Western media. These are shop owners and business owners. These are civil servants. I mean, these are people that had lives that were running major cultural cities and very needed cities across the Horn of Africa being displaced. And they know they're not being covered in Western media. They are well aware of U.S. sanctions. They were well aware of the suspension from AGOA. They're well aware that in the New York Times, CNN, AP, they know the journalists that are keeping them completely out of the news. They have phone numbers. They're saying to me, it's not hard. Like, I was able to get there, and I have a tiny portion of the resources the New York Times and Washington Post has. And so it's, as Hermela is saying, it's not only one-sided, it is aggressively violent what the U.S. media and Western media is doing, along with the U.S. government and regional governments like the government of Egypt, to name one of many. But it is violently erasing these people. And we wouldn't stand for it with any other conflict around the world or history, to completely ignore the pain and suffering of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at this point. And to be there, it's shocking to see. And then again, just to see the Western media the last day and a half here to talk about the weaponization of aid programs. And you're sitting there saying, well, where are the UN humanitarian trucks trying to get to Amhara right now? Where are those trucks right now? As if the people of Tigray, or as Hermela is saying, these are Ethiopians. And I think I just want to stress that, to come back to what Hermela said. People of Addis Ababa, people that live in Amhara state, they do not see the people of the Tigray state as Tigrayans. They see them as Ethiopians, as one people. And I think that also didn't come through when you read the media, but when you're there on the ground, you see people that are desperate for peace, desperate for unity, and desperate for that country to turn the corner.
No, I think those are very, very important points. And you know, thank you, Bob, for your reporting and going there. And you know, I know you had a package on Political Misfits earlier this week that I think, you know, is very worth people checking out and listening to, with the voices of those who have been internally displaced, people who walked for hundreds of miles to escape this devastation. And, you know, Hermela, I was saying this to someone the other day, you know, they say just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. But I mean, it almost seems like, how is it even possible that there is this network of people, these think tanks, the media, all these people who just immediately turned on this pro-TPLF narrative that is in many ways so easily disproven? I mean, is there sort of like a network that's out there? Is this something that has been developed over years? Is it just a lot of just random bad people with bad takes all at once? I mean, what's going on here with the nature of this coverage?
You know, I used to, as you guys know, I went through an evolution in sort of how I look at this, but I used to think that people were exaggerating when they said that the TPLF looted the country's resources. They hoarded so much money overseas. They just have more money than God, basically, was the perception by a lot of Ethiopians. And I'm starting to believe it's true. I've talked to some people high up that know Ethiopia well, that know Ethiopian politics well, and they say a lot of these officials have a lot of money that they have overseas. So I think from what I've gathered, from what I've been told, they have funded some of the Democrats' campaigns. They pay certain people in civic society to be able to say what they say. And so it's not because there's something special about TPLF or they love their old friends or whatever it is. I think there is a lot of financial incentives. I think there's a lot of bullying and harassing. It's not an accident that they were able to stay in power for 27 years, even though the people did not want them there for the majority of that time. They kill, They torture, they pay people off when they need them to do what they need to do. And one indication of how horrible they were and are being is when you look at their children, some of them are incredible people. I'm friends with some of them. And then others are complete bullies. They live in the US. You had some young guys that were in DC where the protest happened earlier this week that were literally harassing women that could have been their mothers. They thought it was okay to show up at this protest where all people were asking for was for peace. And they are on camera just harassing these women. They feel invincible. So they're here in the United States and feel like they can do that. I just wonder what some of their parents are doing when they have the gun and all the power and all the money in that country. So it's quite the network and quite the arrogance.
Well, then let me just ask you this quick follow-up here. I just have to get your thoughts on what you made of this, I don't even know what to call it, so-called press conference of a so-called alliance, so-called government in exile that happened at the National Press Club. I think it was earlier this week.
It is like, is this how low we've gone? Like, is this the standard? I mean, I could not believe my eyes. Honestly, that was a day for laughs. It was a good day for comedy. I think we all needed it. It just shows how weak the TPLF has become, regardless of how much power and money they have. If those are the best people they could get, I mean, they had these 9 so-called federalists, tribal federalists that represent tribes in Ethiopia. There's no indication that they really do, that they have any real connection or representation. And they had somebody come up there, barely could speak English, and said 110 million Ethiopians are behind all 9 of us, and that we are going to forcefully dismantle the Ethiopian government. Now, if this was a little ragtag group and nobody showed up in terms of media, I would say, well, maybe they just did it on their own. But Reuters showed up. The video was from Reuters. There was New York Times reporters there. So they legitimized these people. I mean, nobody stopped and said, hey, it's odd that you're here in the United States saying that you're going to forcefully dismantle an elected government. I did not hear that question asked. So it's really, where are the adults in the room? Who's running US policy right now? I mean, this is not going to be beneficial for the country in any way.
Yeah,
Bob,
it reminds me. I mean, it's so I was just gonna say, it's like any journalist worth their salt should see that happening and maybe ask more questions, like, who is behind these people? How did they even put on this press conference? I didn't see any of that asked. I'm curious, do we know any of those details? Like, because most Ethiopians that I saw commenting on it were like, I've never heard of these people. Like, they are nobodies. They literally have zero
exactly
base.
True. Yeah, it was put together. I mean, you could see one of the guys that was helping one of the so-called federalists fix his mic. He has a TPLF or Tigray flag on his hat. So this is a TPLF minion that lives in the United States. What I gather is they're trying to put on this air of organization, like there is this group that is opposed to the federal government. And so it's all a show. It's really all a show. They're trying to hold on, knowing that the majority of the horn is against them. They're just trying to make it seem like it's something, but it shows you that if that's the best they can get in terms of representation, they're not doing so well right now.
Yeah, that's, I mean, it really just even...
The empire falls. Every empire falls when it doesn't check itself.
No, I think that's a good point. And well, I go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it reminds me, it's more as a comment, it reminds me of like an even bigger joke version of what we saw with like Libya, where you had this government in exile, but it was given a bit more business. What we saw with Syria, what we see with like Juan Guaido in Venezuela, where you have these people just appointing themselves in charge of big countries. But, I think there's something different about Ethiopia because of how big Ethiopia is and how active Ethiopians are, like online English, that it's almost impossible to lie about this. But I'm sorry, Eugene, go ahead. That was just more of a comment than a question.
No, I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it's obviously a relevant point about the role it plays. The only thing I was just going to add is, Bob, I know you had the opportunity to be out there at that massive demonstration in Addis Ababa that took place on this past weekend that, hopefully people saw around the world. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what it was like in that crowd and on the ground amongst the people there.
Yeah, I mean, my last 24 hours there was, again, to read the Western media, to read the U.S. sanctions on the country. You step in there and you're saying, oh my God, am I going to be safe? How's the Ethiopian government going to treat me? And when you're in Addis Ababa, people are obviously on edge. There's obviously great concern in the country and worry, but people are out going about their normal lives. And at early, people told me that the rally was going to start at 9 a.m. It started about 6 a.m. outside my window, just staying there close to Mescal Square where these images are from. And again, it's people that are calling for peace. They're not out there calling for war with the TPLF. They're not calling for war with Tigrayan people. The mood obviously was heavy, but people are calling for an end of conflict. A lot of frustration towards Western media, lots of frustration towards the U.S. government. I think that was shown obviously too if people watching here talking about the Virginia governor's race with 100,000 Ethiopians in Virginia switching their vote. Lots of them, I think 80% of Ethiopians in Virginia support the Democratic Party, but 60% of them said they were going to vote Republican because of Biden's policy. So at that rally, lots of people, as you can see, frustrated with mainstream media, frustrated with Joe Biden. The rest of the day, Sunday, again, if a country was about to be taken by the TPLF, people would not be out at funerals, at social gatherings, eating lunch together. There was a relaxed mood. And then I was telling people on Sunday night, I had the chance to interview the deputy commissioner of the federal police who did the investigation into crimes committed by the TPLF. And again, these images are horrific to see from cities, dead bodies piled on top of each other, animals and livestock killed, crops destroyed. And the deputy commissioner is doing an interview with me, and we're sitting in a private room at the Hyatt, sipping tea. And they show me not only the 9 people that were going to be the government in exile laughing at it, we're also watching the news from the hotel on Al Jazeera with a TPLF official here in Washington, D.C. that has an arrest warrant for them in Ethiopia. And so, as Hermela said, it's all a show. If Addis is about to fall, I promise you, the deputy commissioner of the federal police is not sitting at a Hyatt sipping tea with me doing an interview. They would be a little bit more occupied than that. And so the fact that the TPLF is not even in the country, a lot of their leadership not already even there anymore, lots of them negotiating to leave the country in Washington, D.C. doing interviews. But we're supposed to believe that the Addis Ababa, a town of 5 million people that just rejected the TPLF rule 3 years ago, is all of a sudden going to let their capital fall is absolutely ridiculous. It's just not a true narrative. But again, if you read the Western papers, it says, oh my God, look at what the Ethiopian government's doing. They're unstable. They've lost the backing of the people. The TPLF is going to just march in and take the city. Is absolutely just absurd when you're there, because you're looking around saying, like, this is just not what's happening. And as Ben Norton said, being on the ground, unlike these other media places, you think you're going crazy because what you're reading is not what it's like whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right. To Bob's point, if I may add, there's a physical war happening on the ground, right? And then there's a psychological war that's happening on social media, through Western media. The idea is to get Ethiopians to give up on their government and to get them to think, well, there's nothing we can do, and to just fold. So the idea, or the intent, is to break the spirits of Ethiopians, the majority of whom have voted for this prime minister. Like Bob mentioned earlier, Ethiopians as a whole are not stupid, whether they have formal education or not. They know what they've been living under. They know what their experiences are. They don't need anybody else to tell them. And as one of the videos that went viral from that protest that Bob was at in Addis Ababa, there's a woman who was saying, I know you think Africans are stupid, but we're not. We have a government. We know what we're doing. Let us solve our problems. I mean, the idea that Ethiopians are going to accept a regime that was oppressing them for 27 years is ludicrous. I just don't think this is going to be an easy fight. And this, the CNN report that was talking about the TPLF militias are on the outskirts of Addis when they were really 350 kilometers away, showing a picture from 5 months away of soldiers behind a tree that literally looked like they're right on the edge of Addis, right? So it's like, the psychological terror efforts are completely ridiculous. And I do see some Ethiopians, start to get worried. And, the role of myself and some of the folks that are kind of in the leadership position, whether it's because of doing journalism or activism, is to say, hold on, like, this is the whole point. Hold on. Do not just, turn your wheel every time they tell you something, because we all know the truth is on our side. We all know people want the best for everybody. What's astounding to me is that Ethiopians, non-Tigrayan Ethiopians, seem to care more about what the poor people in Tigray are going through than the Tigrayan pro-TPLF diaspora. I mean, they literally continue to romanticize this war and advocate for it, not thinking about their family members or their friends that could be just dying and they don't know about it yet. So it's not going to be easy to break the spirit of 100 million people.
Yeah, people got to be careful with these so-called map websites too, saying what's going on. A lot of that is also information.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand, like, I was giggling a little bit when you were saying like 300 kilometers away is like, CNN saying, oh, that's the outskirts of Addis. That's ridiculous. I mean, 300 kilometers is like, I think it's like Beirut to Baghdad or something. It's like totally not close. But the point is that actually, what's amazing is the way that the international mainstream media is participating in this kind of psychological warfare, because the purpose of saying that is to basically get soldiers who are on the front lines to be discouraged and scared and to like throw down their weapons and run away. So it's funny and silly, but it's also like that's playing a role in a war when the media does this, because it scares people. Like, we were all watching kind of frightened, like, oh my God, is the capital of Ethiopia about to fall? So it really is amazing. And I think it's also interesting that, there was this pushback recently. CNN did have on, I think it was Becky Anderson, did have on the spokesperson for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. So there's a shift a little bit in the narrative. Like, the fact that spokesperson was on CNN was something new to see. And it does also seem like the pushback has been so big, it's so hard to ignore. I mean, do you see kind of a turning point in the narrative at all?
I would say I hope so, but in many ways.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, go ahead. I was just saying I would hope so, but in many ways, again, democracy now, the kind of anti-war, cool liberal left of America, doubling down the last 2 days. 16 UN staffers detained in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia detains World Food Program drivers, and talking extensively again about Ethiopian government going door to door, rounding up Tigrayans. And you're saying to yourself again, the TPLF dominated every sphere of society and sat in the regional capital, the capital of the country, for 27 years. They were the military. They were the police. They were the undercover agents. They have the weapons and monopoly on violence for 27 years. And now you're saying their comrades are marching towards the capital. And as much as 300 kilometers is far away, in many ways, it's not. And that's quite terrifying. And they're terrorizing and killing people. And you're thinking that the Ethiopian government, the legitimately democratically elected government, is not going to go door to door and check in and have a conversation with some of those leadership from the military police over the last 27 years is absurd. And they're being casted as if they're Japanese American before World War II, being rounded up in detention camps, or Muslims after 9/11 being targeted by US police. And it's like, that's not the equivalent of these people. It's not just average Tigrayans that are shop owners being surveilled and stopped by the Ethiopian government. But yet here Western media is talking as if the TPLF members that are living in Addis Ababa are innocent people that that are not probably still connected with their friends that are 230 miles away, 150 miles away, marching towards the capital. So yeah, I hope it's changing because of people like Breakthrough News and Hermela, and even My Few Days and Amnesty International coming out with a big report that just a few of us shedding light on the lies and the misconceptions taking place. Seems like it's taking and making somewhat of a difference. But again, is it going to stop the U.S. from enacting its interest in the region, or is it just going to lead them to adapt and change and just try a different approach towards their own propaganda?
Yeah, the sad truth is the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and the ideology that they implement is sadly and ironically an ideology that is imprisoning Tigrayans everywhere. It is the opposite of liberation. So there's a lot of Tigrayans that they have either convinced that they're going to win, so they get them to give them information. Maybe they're funding them. Maybe the TPLF itself is paying them to give them information. We know in Dese, Tigrayan Ethiopians that have lived in that city for decades with their fellow Ethiopian neighbors turned on them. They were secretly armed by the TPLF. So when just a week ago, these pro-TPLF activists that claimed to speak for Tigrayans were celebrating the prospect of TPLF violently entering Addis Ababa. So the fact that the federal government now going into Tigrayan homes and detaining and questioning and searching is such a horrible thing is just ridiculous. I know people personally who've had their homes searched, who've been detained, questioned, and released. They had nothing to hide. I recognize it's uncomfortable, it's scary to have your house searched, to be detained for some time, but it's just a necessary thing that people have to do so that the country does not collapse. I've spoke with Tigrayans, people that I know who, claim to be oppressed by this government, but they're on the phone talking to me, excited about the prospect of this government going down. So you're not that scared. You're not that scared, right? You're just arrogant enough to support this armed insurgency, and you're arrogant enough to root for the house that you're living in to light up on fire because you're brainwashed by this ethnic tribal ideology. So I do hope the federal government is very careful. There's not a lot of abuses, but having to detain and question Tigrayans is just part of the security apparatus right now.
Yeah, well, I think that's the whole point too. I mean, there's an evil logic to it, I think, from the beginning to now about what the TPLF is doing is everything is designed to create the maximum amount of, for lack of a better word, ethnic tension in order to use it as a weapon of war. In the same way I think that they've used the humanitarian issue by launching their offensive after the unilateral ceasefire. I mean, they're trying to create the conditions that back up what they're trying to say in order to say, well, look, we told you the whole time. And it really is quite the psychological warfare, but it gives you a sense of exactly who these people are and what they've done and what's been going on. So I don't know, that's no question there. I might have cut you off.
No, you were an expert. Like that is right there. Like they're rounding up Tigrayans that have never been from them. They have riled everybody up, even in the diaspora, people who did not even relate to their ethnicity and were more Ethiopian. They are creating the very conditions they declared at the beginning that were not the case, right? So it's so perceptive of you to see that. That's why I say they're the opposite of the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
I'm curious, something that I've noticed about this issue that I think is quite fascinating and interesting is the fact that so many Ethiopians are like, I'm getting messages, Ethiopian-Americans, Ethiopians in Ethiopia, being like, wow, because of what the US is doing in Ethiopia, like I'm starting to really look back at all, and you told me this too, Hermela. I'm actually starting to look back at all these other countries that, I thought the US was maybe right to intervene in, but maybe like I got that wrong. And it just seems like a real radicalizing moment. And, Ethiopia has been this long time US ally. And now, you see at the protests over the weekend, there was like photos of Ethiopians holding up signs, blasting CNN, blasting the BBC, blasting the US government. So I guess, Bob, I'm curious, while you were there, if you saw that sentiment on display, is there this growing sentiment in Ethiopia that's kind of like, a recognition about American imperialism? I don't know if it was there before, but it certainly seems to be on display now. What was it like on the ground with that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I just speaking for myself, coming back on that flight, never have I wanted to be less a part of the United States than that. And to come back and saying, I don't want to be part of this project anymore. I feel complicit. I feel a part of it. And as Hermela is saying, kind of how the conditioning done by the TPLF is what the U.S. government has done to our own people in this country, and this false choice between Democrats and Republicans, and thinking that it's okay for our government to act like it is right now in the Horn of Africa is absolutely absurd. And to think that Donald Trump calling for Egypt to possibly bomb the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is any different than Joe Biden supporting the TPLF like he has, as if they're different presidents, and that matters to the Ethiopian people right now, who do not want to be at war with the TPLF, do not want their country's progress to be slowed down, who want to be respected by the international community, as if they see Donald Trump and Joe Biden any differently from one another. And people, absolutely, that sentiment is loud and clear. And this arc of the last 15, 20 years, from George Bush's invasion of Iraq to drone Mr. former Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama dropping 30,000 bombs his last year in office, to then Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And you're telling me that people aren't well aware of the scam at this point? No, absolutely. And it's sad because people were saying we used to dream of living in the United States. We wanted the United States to be that country that everybody aspired to be. We have lots of family in the United States, and we were concerned about their well-being and their safety. But now we're concerned about those living in the United States. And that's just not just in Ethiopia, that's around the world. And it's just, as a citizen of this country, it's sad, it's devastating. And like I said, to continue to live here knowing what my labor as turned into taxpayer dollars helps fund right now in the Horn of Africa, it's sickening.
Yeah. I can relate to that, because I mean, I think one of the ways that I learned about American imperialism was through the relentless attacks against the region of the world I'm from. I'm curious, Hermela, I know we talked a little bit about this when I had you on last week, which I, by the way, for all of those who are watching, if you haven't already seen on my Breakthrough News Show Dispatches, I did do a fantastic interview with Hermela last week
Yes.
about this issue. But we kind of like touched on this. But yeah, I'm curious if you have anything to add to that, just about the general sentiment about sort of America's foreign policy, because it's just insane how one-sided the U.S. it has been on this. It seems like Ethiopians have this idea that, or feel as though the U.S. government has essentially turned against Ethiopia and is trying to dismantle the country.
Yeah, I think Ethiopian Americans are conflicted. Many of us, myself included, got a lot from the United States. So much of the opportunities that we have, the ability to even speak right now about this, is from living in the United States. And Ethiopian Americans are well aware that the West helped, TPLF sort of oppress voices and was sort of a tool for them. But I don't think that they thought that once the leadership changed, once they protested and died and fought for 20 plus years to get some human rights reforms into that country and get a new leader, I don't think they thought that the United States would stick with TPLF to the extent that it did. It does. It's not just that the diplomatic false equivalencies, but we know that the United Nations, there are people within the United Nations at the top of the United Nations that are working with the TPLF to redirect humanitarian aid to war. They're sending them communication devices and who knows what else. And so, the US being the biggest donor to the United States, that's an arm of the US. And so the extent to which it seems, broadly speaking, the US is going to sabotage Ethiopia is astounding. I don't know that it was within any Ethiopian's imagination. So I'm not going to hold my breath, but I think if anybody is interested in not having another disaster, foreign policy in terms of at least the U.S., the perception of the U.S., it's not too late to correct their path. But like I said, I'm not going to hold my breath, because last week was a new low with those so-called Federalists, and I just don't know what we're going to see next week.
Yeah, I think that's it certainly was quite low. There's no doubt about that. But, one other sort of flip side of that coin, Hermela, that I think has been, exciting to see, at least for me, is the amount of people coming together in the Horn of Africa and Africa more broadly, and of course around the world, in opposition to what's happening. I mean, seeing, folks from Somalia, from South Sudan, all parts of Ethiopia, Djibouti, Uganda, Kenya, over the past couple weeks, all sort of uniting around this message of opposing this just ridiculous, insurgency, I don't even know what to call this ridiculous attempt to divide and destroy Ethiopia, has in and of itself, I think, been an important moment, and feels like, I don't know, you never know until you're out of it, I guess, something of an inflection point for Africa writ large, where I feel more people talking about Pan-Africanism, the future of the continent, what it means to actually sort of build an independent, sovereign, equitable country in the context of, all of the geopolitics of the globe. Talk about that if you could, because it really does seem that the outpouring of support, positivity, and coming together is also a big part of this story.
Absolutely. What I've come to learn is that TPLF is not just an Ethiopia problem. It's the reason that Eritreans are in the condition that they're in because their government has been sidelined and isolated by the TPLF for the last 20 plus years. And so they see the TPLF's elimination as a way of their government letting up a little bit because they don't have this enemy that they share a border with. So the liberation of Ethiopia from TPLF is also the liberation of Eritrea. When you talk to Somalis, they almost have worse stories about the TPLF and the way that they use their power to oppress and suppress them in the name of eliminating terrorism, Al-Shabaab. So their reach is so much wider than I could have ever imagined. And I think, Eugene, you said this in one of your clips. You called them like the largest imperialist force on the continent, and it seems to be true. When I'm working with people like Simon Tesfar Mariam from Eritrea, Nebiyu Asfaw, who's a community organizer in Denver, Ethiopian community organizer, we're not just talking about our Ethiopia bubble. We're talking about how can we eliminate these systems that oppress the majority of the people for the ultra greedy, for people who are just absolutely insatiable and are willing to let people die and kill people and oppress hundreds of millions of people in order to maintain their power. When I say insatiable, I mean, you've had power for 27 years, you've collected more money than you can ever spend while you're alive. So you would think in 2018, TPLF would just go, you know what? Okay, we've had our reign, but they had to start a war in hopes of getting some more. So they're insatiable. I think that hearing people like Bob Norton talking about Nicaragua, hearing people talk about other countries where similar forces have helped oppress the majority of the people, it's encouraging. It's encouraging because I never wanted to talk about Ethiopia in a bubble. I'm not an ethnicist. I'm not nationalist. I just genuinely believe in the truth. I cannot stand lies that don't take the lives of people into consideration. So yeah, it really has opened up this new movement, and you guys are a part of it, of people who are just humanists first, you know. So it's exciting. I think that the fact that the West was just sloppy on Ethiopia, like they didn't even lie to us well. You know what I mean? So in a way, that's been a gift because it's opened up the eyes of so many people across the continent and across the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I really appreciate both you and the work you're doing, and Bob, you know, being there on the ground. And I really do. Again, I just want to plug this. I hope folks go listen to the package you put together there for Political Misfits with the voices of those who have been internally displaced by this conflict. Really important to hear that directly. But Hermela, Bob, I'm sure we'll have you back. So this is not goodbye, just till next time. But thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Wow, that was an
Yeah.
illuminating discussion.
I'm sorry, Ron, you broke up a little
Oh, I
bit.
cut. That was an illuminating discussion. And I gotta say, Eugene, I mean, it's really like Hermela said something to me when I had her on last week that I actually felt like again now, which it's like there's something therapeutic about to talk about this. And I think for people being able to see journalists talk about this from a realistic, truthful perspective, because there are so many lies on this issue and it can be traumatizing. Like when you know the reality isn't what you're seeing. I felt this way about Syria. I feel this way about Lebanon, about Iran, about Cuba, about all these countries. And just, you know, I just feel like it's one of those moments where it's important to note, like, Breakthrough News is able to do this. And I think we're one of the only outlets. And I love that we're able to provide this kind of coverage. I think we're one of the few outlets doing this, providing this coverage on a regular basis among a handful. And so I just want to use this as a moment to remind people who are watching and who appreciate this coverage on issues like Ethiopia. You can support our work and our ability to cover this stuff by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a patron. It helps support our work and our ability on these things, both here and on the ground, going to places. And furthermore, you can always throw money in the super chat and donate there on YouTube if you appreciate what you're watching.
Since you mentioned the super chat, we got a lot of support in the super chat while Hermela and Bob were on. Honestly, there's too many to read everything. I just want to read out folks' names, though. Really appreciate everybody. This was huge. Patrick, Hyatt, Peace Love, Abi, Amanu, Zemed, Twice, Maul, Khaled, Jelperman, Alazar, Ashnaki Negus, Mr. Addis Samwan, Abrar, Sammy, sorry, Eden, just reading him now. Someone Black Devil, that's quite the name. And Lolly Bella. Shout out to all you for donating there in the super chat, and really appreciate everybody who supported us, both in the last segment and at all segments and at all times. It's really fantastic to see the support we've gotten from the very beginning, really, here at Breakthrough News, from our audience and our intrepid supporters in so many different ways. So, shout out to all of y'all. Really appreciate everybody. And there's actually more coming in. Get a Shaw coming in as well. People putting some very significant amounts in here too. So just know we're thinking about you. We remember you, and we really appreciate what you're doing there. But important issues. I agree with you, Rania, that it is a pleasure really to have the opportunity to talk about this. It's, in a way, I'm glad we're here and able to do it. I'm also disappointed that we've seen such a kind of one-sided reality. Whatever you may know, whatever we may think, whatever our structural critiques are of the mainstream media, I still think it's outrageous, the nature of it. I mean, I remember talking to Bob when he's flying in there, and I'm like, hey, be careful, man, because when I'm seeing on the media, and he gets there, he's like, I don't know, it seems pretty fine here. So, wild situation, but thank you.
It's also just so outrageous. I mean, it's like one state after another, just trying to dismantle one state after another, causing these wars, these horrible refugee crises that result, just destabilizing. This is the second largest country in Africa. There's over 100 million people. Not that it would be okay if it was a country of 10 million.
Sure.
But I mean, the magnitude of trying to dismantle the state of Ethiopia, it's absolutely mind-boggling. Like, the ramifications, should the US and its TPLF partners succeed in doing this. Could you imagine? I mean, think Syria was a country of 30 million. The US tried to dismantle it with a bunch of regional partners. It caused a refugee crisis that spilled into Europe and literally changed the politics of Europe. It shifted the entire continent further to the right.
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine a country as big as Ethiopia, what dismantling that would do, the refugee waves that would cause, how that would impact the region and really the world? I mean, it's just the irresponsibility and the recklessness is just so unbelievably outrageous. So yeah, I'm sorry. I just can't get over it. It's
okay. Well, we'll keep coming back. So you can keep coming back to it.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot out there in the news in general. One of the big issues is the Rittenhouse trial. Kyle Rittenhouse, who is on trial for murdering 3 people there in Kenosha after the murder of Jacob Blake. I think Juan, are you with us? Juan from the booth. I know we've been talking about this a lot here in the office with this trial and all the ridiculousness. Juan, welcome. Good to see you. Good to have you here. How you feeling?
Pleasure to see y'all,
Well, I don't know how you were feeling when you saw Kyle Rittenhouse crying, breaking down on the stand. I have to admit, I actually chuckled a little bit, but then I got a little upset because, one of the things that, and we've been talking about this, I know, Juan, you and I and a few of us here at the Breakthrough News studios off and on, it's like there's almost like this shift starting to happen where it's like it's not quite that Kyle Rittenhouse is good per se, although that's coming from the right wing, but almost sort of this like, well, maybe it's like a little bit more complicated than we thought. And maybe, we have to understand like his side of the story. He was fearing for this, but it just feels like
he was defending his family's gas station, right? Wait, he was. There were looters were going to his grandma's house, and he stopped them.
Cross state lines to make sure that he made it.
With a
I hate
rifle
to
that
laugh,
he
but
couldn't legally use in that state either, right?
Right.
His friend's rifle or his friend's assault rifle. It's like it was an assault rifle.
I mean, it really feels like everyone is kind of forgetting.
His mom drove him there.
Everyone seems to be kind of forgetting what he was there for, to be part of this vigilante mob and really what lies behind so much of this. But before I editorialize a little too much on it, I don't know if we actually were able to get this clip, Juan. It was sort of a mashup of clips talking about sort of the role of the police and these various, individuals, as it were, who were showing up doing whatever. I know I was looking at something.
We got a couple clips. We have one of the police actually thanking the militia. I can show real quick.
Yeah, show that one. I mean, that's the water bottle.
Hey, thank you guys. Need water? Seriously. Guys to our right, you need water. We need water. We'll throw you one. Thank you. All right, come on, guys. Let's get out of here. We got a couple. We got to save a couple, but we'll give you a couple. We appreciate you guys. We really do.
I think what you wanted to see was the visual representation of the police pushing.
Well, it doesn't really matter. I can just explain it. I mean, it's rather than run through a bunch of clips. Some of the testimony from one of the guys who you actually saw in that video with Kyle Rittenhouse, they were walking around together. And by the way, they were just roaming around Kenosha for hours looking for things. But what this gentleman said when he was on the stand was that a police officer told him, so listen, what we're going to do is drive them towards y'all, and then they're your problem. And the New York Times later actually did sort of like a moment-by-moment recreation showing how the police actually did funnel protesters down the street towards these armed vigilantes, essentially, and as this person was saying, from their point of view, being one of the armed vigilantes, so it gives you some sense of even how they felt about it, that they sort of set it up. They sort of set it up to drive protesters to people who I'm sure they assumed were more likely, or if not more likely, at least to remove culpability from themselves, to have like a very significant, and here it is to my left here, a very significant attack on protesters. And you can see in orange, that's the police moving the protesters in white down to where Rittenhouse and some of these other people are. So, I mean, the reason that water bottle thing is important, and they say, hey, we really appreciate y'all, and, thanks for being out here, is it really does seem that the police were not only thanking them, but essentially using these vigilantes to suppress those who were out on the streets, deeply angry about this, racist police murder, which, I mean, there's so many different things that can be said about that, but it really is to me, a very important wrinkle that has come out in the whole trial and of the whole story about what went down that night.
Yeah, I think that the broader issue that you're bringing up is what's missing from all the media coverage, regardless of like what slant it has, is that this 17-year-old was incited by a right-wing media apparatus to and that is supportive of like behaving as brutally as they do in America against this really uprising that was taking place. He was incited to take his friend's assault rifle, and his mother collaborated with him to take him across state lines to go participate in right-wing vigilantism that the police supported. Like, this was a force multiplier for the police officers, and that's why they were asking them, do you need water? That's why Kyle Rittenhouse, after he shot 3 people, was able to walk around armed with his assault rifle and like drive away without anybody asking him anything.
He literally ran past.
Yeah, there's the famous video.
Nobody stopped him.
This way.
Yeah,
he's going this way. It's unbelievable.
Because he was working with the police. Like this is a situation where police are using right-wing vigilantes against like basically anti-racist protesters, and that's what should be out. This entire apparatus is what incited the 17-year-old boy. Like, that's what we should be talking about here, and instead it's turned into this really obsession with like letting him off the hook. Oh, he was, it was self-defense. I mean, I don't buy it. You had an assault rifle that you were firing.
You came there from another
you
state.
shot.
I mean, you had no legal authority. You're just a random person. And by the way, illegally out after the curfew. And so what possible self-defense? You went there obviously looking for trouble. And I mean, I don't know why else you would go across state lines with a gun saying you want to, defend businesses, although I guess he's claiming he went as a medic. But I mean, other than when you're
like the opposite
looking
of what a
for
medic
trouble.
is supposed to do.
Yeah.
He did like the exact
shot
opposite
people.
of what a medic. Yeah, he killed people.
And
He
I
does
think-
claim that he wrapped an
and I
ankle
think-
sometime in the night.
I think something that's also missing from the cover analysis of this in the mainstream and, actually across the political spectrum is the precedent it would set if this guy it ends up getting off. Like, what
Mm.
does that mean? Does that mean that right wingers who feel like they're like there's two things. Does that mean that right wing vigilantism is now acceptable and okay, even if you kill people? And then the second thing is, does that mean people who take it upon themselves to quote unquote protect property from anarchists or whatever narrative they're telling? Does that mean that if they feel like their life is under threat, they can shoot and kill whoever without any consequences, which is already what police do, right? But now just like average citizens who've self-deputized themselves as, like helping the police can just kill protesters? Because that's the precedent that this would set. It's actually really dangerous.
But that's the precedent that they've been trying to set
Mm.
because they've tried to legalize the running over protesters by cars. Like
Yep.
like the thing is that like there's a blatant attack against
Mhm.
people that are rising up against police brutality, against systematic oppression, and on the other side, the people that are murdering people because they feel like it's their job to are getting away scot free.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it
It's not the
really,
first
I think
time.
that
It's
certainly,
not the first time.
no, it's not even close to the first time. I mean, it really, similar sort of narrative as, the Ahmed Arbery trial, slightly different situation or significantly different situation, but same basic reality that they're saying they had the right
Yeah.
to defend themselves because, he was a danger or a threat to them. But it does sort of speak, I think, when we talk about the Rittenhouse trial to this broader reality that, and I think this is ultimately what's behind a lot of what I was saying at the beginning, kind of the shift in feeling or whatever around Rittenhouse, is this idea that, well, yeah, maybe they were actually out of control rioters, and really the people who are out there is just sort of, a multiracial group of concerned citizens, business owners, and whatever, just trying to sort of keep the peace, and to really kind of normalize that kind of vigilante behavior in the context of a broader situation in this country where there are going to be more uprisings and there are going to be more people who are going to be angry
Yeah.
as hell because there are going to certainly be many more police killings. And we've already seen that the Democrats in power are unwilling to do anything
Mhm.
substantial whatsoever to curb the rampant police terrorism here in the United States. And so, not only are the police becoming militarized and all these other things that we know that they've done, but they're now institutionalizing further and further, at least attempting to institutionalize further and further, sort of a mob mentality that can go hand in glove with the
Fascistic.
uniformed mob mentality that's out there to put people down. And I think it's all part of a demonization of uprisings and the idea that somehow uprisings are bad and anything that's done against those who are engaged in them is at least,
Well,
borderline
not all
legitimate, if not totally.
uprisings. Not all uprisings, of course, because the
Right.
same people who are supporting this guy, of course, are like,
Mm.
oh my God, January 6th was like an
Right.
uprising and it's okay what happened. But, to speak to what you're saying, like, I think that there's a couple things happening here. I mean, first of all, this started, I feel like, with George Zimmerman. Maybe
Mm.
I'm wrong to say that, but I
No,
feel this
you're
this
right.
mentality, this right, like him getting off for
Yeah.
deputizing himself
Yeah.
and saying I was acting in self-defense by like hound this 16-year-old black child, and then literally getting away with murder. I
Mm.
mean, at least for me, that's the first time that I can recall where like that was said to be okay and that kind of set a precedent. And then you saw it happen in a few other cases where people got away with doing these kinds of things. And then you see, more recently, like with that bill, I think it was like in Oklahoma where the state legislator passed some sort of bill or tried to, where saying that if people run over protesters, like
Yeah.
it's okay or something, like basically deputizing them to take down protests. I mean, I think this speaks to, and I don't throw this word around lightly because I really don't, people just throw around the word fascism, but this speaks to a kind of formation of like a neo-fascist movement. You have a mob on the street that is acting as vigilantes to help
Mm.
suppress protests when capitalism is in crisis. Like, what else do you call that other than some sort of neo-fascist movement?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I mean, it's in a way I hear you because it's such a loaded phrase and it's
Yeah.
often so abused, but I do think that it's a fair point to make and I think it really speaks very much to sort of well, not only the history of fascism in general, but its roots in the United States. I mean, let's not forget that when the Nazis were perfecting what they were doing, they were looking to the United States for inspiration and also, to sort of celebrate, because they viewed a lot of the history of this country, quite frankly, as more or less justification for what they're doing, and certainly the racial theories of many of the so-called founding fathers here in the United States. And, you link that, you put all these different pieces together. I mean, you made the point, Rania, about the people who are, shedding crocodile tears for Kyle Rittenhouse are the same people who are celebrating the January 6th protesters. They're also the same people who are promoting and stoking this critical race theory hoax. I mean, I don't know any school that's actually teaching critical race theory, but even if they were, I don't know why exactly that would be a problem. But when you listen to what they're saying about critical race theory, and it's one of those things that they're not even actually talking about the real thing. What they're actually talking about is teaching about racism. And when you look at the different resolutions and bills and laws they're passing in these different states, what it talks about is you can't teach things that suggest that there's anything structural, right? That the United States was founded in racism or genocide, or that there is structural racism, that you can't teach all those things. Now, the deep irony here is that most of these people constantly say, oh, well, what we should do is we should only teach what the founding fathers were really saying, which, that is what they were really saying, is that they were white supremacist, classist, elitist individuals who were setting up a government specifically in order to aggregate power to themselves
they didn't
and
hide
to keep
it.
out other people. So please, by all means, study exactly what they were saying. But the point being is they don't want people to be able to connect these dots, to connect the dots to the fact that when you really look at what's happening, and I think that's why January 6th is an important sort of, marker here. If you really look at what's happening in the country, you have an extreme, elite, destructive, right-wing agenda being promoted by a very significant subset of the richest Americans. Donald Trump was their front man. They know that there are a huge spectrum of people who, for various reasons, feel that this is not the way to go, and that universal suffrage is in many ways an enemy to the ability of them to impose their agenda. And just like in Reconstruction, when the same thing is true, when universal suffrage becomes a blockage to the unfettered rule of elites in this country, what's the first thing they start doing is legitimizing mobs and delegitimizing elections. And they're legitimizing mobs, they're delegitimizing elections, and then they're saying that you can't teach the history. Sorry about that. Thank you, Juan,
That's
for
how true it is.
covering me. They will delegitimize the history that'll help people connect the dots. I mean, it's very clear what they're trying to do, and it's, strengthen their stranglehold on the country, make sure that there's nothing good and nothing positive for average, working class people. It's more transparent than it seems, but there are all these sleights of hands, from critical race theory to the so-called crime wave that's not real either, to, I'm sure whatever else we can come up with. I'm gonna drink some water now.
And I definitely, I don't want to make this a stretch, but I feel like all this happening at the same time. The same thing with the infrastructure bill, the same thing with the lack of infrastructure bill. Like, it shows the need of an actual revolution in this country, of the masses, whether if it's backing another party, whether it's folks taking the street to another level, because after a year of so many deaths, after so many people losing loved ones, after an uprising, a righteous uprising against the systematic oppression, white supremacists are going to go free, possibly, right? There's nothing really being given back to people. The Democrats aren't doing much, and the Republicans are passing things left and right.
Yeah.
So
I think you're right. Like, liberals have shown themselves, by liberals, I mean the Democratic Party has shown itself unequipped to respond to any of these crises. And as a result, what I see, or what I fear is going to happen, not that it's okay when Democrats are in charge, but it's like, you can just see the writing on the wall. It's a ping pong, and it's going right back to the Republicans in 2024 at this rate. I mean, and you already saw the beginnings of that in Virginia. Because you know what? Everybody's talking about Virginia as, going Republican because Democrats didn't fulfill their progressive promises. I think that's a part of it. But I also think it's in conjunction with the fact that the right wing is very well organized in this country and has a very well organized media apparatus that reaches tens of millions, if not more people. And as a result, they were able to get a bunch of parents in Virginia riled up and scared over this made up, critical race theory thing, and turn the state red again. And it reminds me a lot of the way that the right-wing media apparatus was able to bring about a red wave from the Tea Party, which was another AstroTurf movement. And again, like it's just the same, it's deja vu. The same thing happens. Democrats win, they do nothing because they suck, because they're owned by the same people who own the Republicans.
But that's
and
really
they
what
just
it
kind of
is.
keep the status quo going along until Republicans win again.
That's really what it is. Like you said, like there's a right-wing media apparatus, and the so-called liberal media is not very far left from that right-wing media apparatus. So we don't get a diverse narrative. That's why we do this work, right? We're doing this work because literally there's nobody else doing it, or there's a handful of people doing it, but no one in the mainstream doing this work. Whether it's covering the Ethiopia, where it's covering cases in the United States. And it's because it suits a certain narrative. It fits a certain narrative. It puts money in certain people's pockets without really shaking the status quo. And that's not what we need from journalism, right? They're doing a disservice to the people.
Yeah.
And is when they realize that what they've done is either going to be too late and they're going to blame somebody else.
Well, let's just keep moving here. And I think those points are very well taken. And, maybe this next segment is really to some degree connected to this broader sort of climate that we're talking about. And, we want to turn to Saratoga, where there is some movement, or at least hopefully some movement, around the case of Daryl Mount, who was murdered by police there. This is in upstate New York in 2013. We are very honored to be joined as we continue the show here to talk about these developments by Lexus Figueroa, who is an organizer with BLM Saratoga. Lexus, thanks so much for being back with us here on the Freedom Side. Oh, we can't hear you, and you're slightly off camera.
Yeah, there we go. Better. There you go. Now we can see you. Oh, wait. Other way.
We're in like a
Whatever
stage,
you're doing,
left
do
stage,
the
right
opposite.
situation.
Yeah, whichever way you're moving your camera.
There we go. There we
Okay.
go.
And now for the sound. I think you're muted. Is it from your end or ours? See, if it was from his end by now, I know, because he would have unmuted. So maybe it's from our end.
No, we can't hear you yet.
We can't hear him.
Nope.
It's always fun when this happens live. What are you gonna do? If you go to the setting, we gotta.
Oh, thank you, Rania, for jumping in.
I'm just gonna be the tech guy. I don't know why I'm pretending like I know anything.
You should not. Rania, don't.
You gotta fake it until you make it, Eugene.
Well,
I don't know.
Wow, that's one of my favorite phrases. Did you know that?
I think I got it from you.
I think, Lexus, you can hear us, but I don't know if we can hear you yet.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're gonna see if we can pull this one together here. So we'll figure this out and we'll bring it back. But yeah,
why don't you set up some background actually to what we're about to talk about? Maybe?
Of course. Daryl Mount, who was, the police say that it was an accident, but it was they say that he just fell from scaffolding, but they were chasing him. I think it seems vastly more likely that, whatever happened, it was their responsibility. There was just a wild cover-up that happened where they said they were investigating, but they never actually opened an investigation. And it's been a long piece. And, folks may remember we had Lexus on, I think this was a couple weeks back, talking about how it's now organizers in Saratoga who have been targeted for standing up for protesting. All sorts of bogus charges, were thrown on people. And in the course of the recent elections and the recent election day, I'm now telling the whole story. There was someone new who was brought
an important one
in Saratoga to the city council, who's now promising to open up some new avenues. So it's, at least perhaps an open window, a glimmer of a possibility of at least learning. If there's no real accountability, at least learning what took place, because obviously there was an attempted cover-up. And I think that, if we want to draw from other things we've seen from Laquan McDonald and other things like that, I think usually you get the sense if there's some sort of cover up, that means that there absolutely was something that the police want to hide and that their story is not the actual story. Now, of course, that's, 9 times out of 10, their story is not the actual story. And we've seen this again and again and again. We actually just recently saw it with the brother in DC whose name is eluding me, who was, killed riding a moped after a chase, where they've actually charged 2 of the officers for one of the very few times that happens because of a
Really?
number of lies that they told. Yeah. And, just like we have seen in multiple cases, those chases are technically illegal, but they engage in them anyway, increasing the danger towards people. So, this just
Could
speaks to,
you
I think, the broader climate we are in this country, where despite all of the millions of people who have taken the streets, there is still so much pushback in the
Yeah.
political scene to making any substantive change. I mean, there was such a theme of the elections we saw last week is it's just like 1 year after the largest ever protest in the history of the country around the issue of racism and policing. Now you want to tell me that actually this is the least popular issue in America? I mean, it just doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah,
What?
what's interesting about all this is it's, I mean, it really is like funny. Not okay, funny is not the right word, but I mean, the US is just like we've said this whole program, we've been talking about the situation in so many other countries that are being targeted by the US for like, under the guise of humanitarianism or like not being democratic enough. And it's just like, man, when you hear all these stories out of the US, it's like, who are you moralizing to? I mean, from one, I'm not saying every story is the same, but like you said, there is this like thread that you could like through all of these different states and cities and towns where there's something similar happening, where like protesters are being prosecuted, and where police are covering things up, and people are being killed, and vigilantes, and it's just like, what is happening in this
Yeah.
country?
Well,
And
and
it's
it should be said too, since it was mentioned earlier, Gary Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, by the way, who is saying that he's going to stand up in the state of Virginia to make sure that they don't bring back parole, because that was a big conversation. People might remember, who are from Virginia, in 1995, they eliminated parole as part of George Allen and his whole tough on crime gubernatorial moment there in the state of Virginia. The state legislature was talking about bringing back parole, and Youngkin made a big issue about how he was going to, work with the legislature to oppose any parole for anyone in the state of Virginia. So, it gives you a sense of the politics. But I think we have Lexus back here. I think we are good to go. So we're going to bring Lexus back in.
All right, let me get in the camera.
Boom.
we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, Lexus, I really appreciate you being with us here. And, before we go into the most recent update, just take us back quickly to 2013. Tell us what happened, with Mr. Mount and what the police did or didn't do at that moment.
Yeah, we have in 2013, he was allegedly they said that he assaulted his girlfriend in front of some officers in a bar. Then it led to a foot chase where the police officers, and the videos that you could see that they released, you can see from the streets that the cops are like 10 feet behind them. Somehow he turns into Superman. He disappears from the police officer's sight, ends up on top of scaffolding that was down one of these hills, and somehow ends up on the ground, unresponsive, face down on the ground with his face smashed in.
Wow. And then the police, I believe, lied about looking into it.
Yep, they did. The police said that they were going to do an investigation. They said that there was a internal investigation going on about the case that actually never ever happened. It was found in the media that was a lie from the chief of police.
Wow.
Yes.
I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but to say you're doing an investigation and not do it is just, there's so much to that. But so bringing us up to, and thank you for that context, where we are now. So obviously we've just passed the electoral season, as it were. I believe a new gentleman has come on to the city council, and what's happening now? It looks like there's at least some possibility of at least learning more about what took place that evening.
There is. They're supposed to be, he's supposed to be releasing something on Inauguration Day. As far as his report, he is a lawyer, I think, for about 30 years or so, from New York City. So, he does have a lot of law knowledge. In my opinion, just the fact that he's even willing to have a conversation at this point. We've been fighting for 17 months as far as protests, and we've been fighting since 2013 to get any conversations or any talks. Keep in mind, this case is also in civil case right now too. There's a lawsuit going on as well against the city for the wrongful death.
Wow. And I mean, I guess I probably know the answer to this question, but I want to ask. I'm sure that the cops who are involved in this, if they're still on the force, they are probably not faced any form of discipline.
Oh, not at all. They're definitely on the force. They actually still come to they're the people who police us at our protests, these same officers.
I mean, It really is just, it raises so many questions because, the last time we had you on, y'all had just been grabbed up, criminalized for protesting. I mean, talk about how it feels that maybe there's some opening here when obviously it seems the police have been working overtime to prevent any form of oversight or accountability.
I mean, it definitely feels good, for sure. With all the work, all the time we've been putting our, bodies on the line for this, it feels very good to at least have a start in the move and start in the right direction.
What has been the general sort of aftermath from the last time we've had you on about what has been happening in terms of you all in BLM Saratoga being criminalized for protesting?
Nothing else has been going on right now except for, back and forth with the DAs. My lawyer hasn't even received the discovery yet, all the discovery for my case yet. So, we have a lot of funny stuff going on in Saratoga Springs. The Attorney General's office, actually, of New York State has said that they are looking into maybe investigating Saratoga Springs Police Department. NYCLU has put out statements time and time again against their, brutality and the way they're going after us. Like we said, there was no investigation for Daryl Mount, but there was an investigation on us.
I mean, it's certainly interesting to hear that the Attorney General is thinking about investigating them. I mean, from your point of view, the importance of the Daryl Mount case, I mean, obviously every case in every individual life is very important, but is it really a symbol of just the broader reality of what cops have been getting away with there, I'm sure, for years?
It definitely is. Daryl Mount is not the only case, we have other cases of police brutality and other cases of even death that are still, have no answers to. So, yeah, I mean, I lived there for 27 years. My experience was very much dealing with police brutality.
I mean, it's one of these things that I feel is so, you hear about every place in the country and it seems the same everywhere. And here, I'd never even really heard of Saratoga prior to having y'all on, and we're seeing that, it's the same thing there. So, I mean, how do you just place what is happening with y'all right now and just the broader moment we are in, where there's been so much protesting and so many things happening, but so much resistance in terms of real change? I mean, what direction do you think the country is moving in? Are things moving forward slowly but surely, or is it still contested ground?
I would have to say definitely contested ground. It's very hard right now. Like I was listening to the show earlier, we were talking about the Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats said that talked a big game, so that they were going to do a lot of things that we don't actually see them doing. Joe Biden got his votes off of the black people's backs, and they're not really doing much. Kamala Harris. And as you stated, the GOP has a very good strategy, so it's working. And it's actually being more divisive as far as throughout the country. So, yeah, I see things going in a negative way, honestly, but, we're going to fight and keep fighting until we turn this around.
Mm-hmm. So the new information is coming out January 1st, or I guess early January, whenever the inauguration is. What are some of the next steps that you all are taking either now or preparing to take as this moves forward with the possibility of at least some new look into Daryl Mount's murder?
I mean, our next steps are still we've been fighting for a civilian review board, which seems simple, but it's been fought for 10 years now. We're trying to get a civilian review board with some subpoena powers and some actual teeth in it, ran by community members to have oversight of the police. Things like that are the biggest things to us. And actually, something like that could have made sure that what happened with Daryl Mount wouldn't have ever been able to happen. There would have had to be an investigation. So we need to make sure there's never another Daryl Mount. Besides that, we're going to stay going to these city council meetings, having our voices heard. And, we were a big part in the reason why the Democrats actually got elected in Saratoga Springs. Unlike the rest of the country, They actually did very good in Saratoga Springs. We got 4 city council seats, including the mayor. And, we are going to be expecting them to reciprocate, by actually doing what they say and having us a part of the discussion and a part of the teams.
Well, before we let you go, Lexus, just let people know where they can find y'all on the internet, on social media, or whatever. I'm sure people will want to find a way to support.
Yeah, we're on Saratoga Black Lives Matter. That'll be on Facebook, and we are also on Instagram as well. Saratoga BLM on Instagram, and my personal Facebooks and stuff, Els Figueroa. So,
right on. Well, Lexus, really appreciate you. Thanks so much for coming back on, and we'll continue to follow this case and y'all's work as it moves forward.
Thank you for having me again.
Of course. Well, Rania, I think it feels like we do one of these every week, and every week it just
for good reason.
For good reason, and it really just is such a reminder, an important reminder, I think, of why people like myself have always called this police terrorism over and above police brutality, because 1,000 people killed every year, tens of thousands of people who are being brutalized, millions of people in jail. It's more than just brutality or misconduct. It really is police terrorism on whole communities.
Intentional. It's intentional.
Well, let's keep it moving to the other, maybe the big story, if you will, of the past 2 weeks. That's the COP26 summit in Scotland that at least allegedly ends tomorrow, although I know that there is some back and forth about that. We are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Harjeet Singh, who is a senior advisor on climate impacts for Climate Action Network International. Harjeet, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So as we reach the end or close to the end of the COP26 summit, all the discussion now is around, what the final agreement is going to be. I'm curious your thoughts observing it of A, what do you think of some of what we heard about what will be in this final agreement? And B, how significant do you think these pledges will end up being in reality?
So this particular COP or Conference of Parties is important to give a sense of confidence to everybody that the temperature will not rise beyond 1.5 degrees, as the global average temperature. Because at this moment, we are living at 1.1 degree warmer world, and we can see devastating wildfires, floods, storms, and sea levels are rising. And it's not only just in the developing world, as it was thought so several years ago. We have seen wildfires in Europe, in Canada, US, Australia, and massive heat waves in Canada recently. So it's everywhere, but the reality is that developing countries are least prepared, and they are least responsible for the crisis, because industrialization is what has caused the problem in the first place. So this is the COP, this is the conference where we have to make sure that our emissions don't rise, and we have to bring them down to a level, as science says. In fact, we have to halve them by 2030. So far...
No, please.
Go ahead. So far, we still don't see that kind of confidence that this COP has given to the wider world. And the important part to achieve that transition that is required to move away from coal, oil, and gas is to provide finance. And that is where there has been the most disappointment from the developed world side, who have not met their commitment of 2009.
I'm glad you raised that point. I know that John Kerry, who's the special representative, I think it is, for climate from the United States, saying that we will meet that original goal, that 2009 goal. I believe it's $100 billion a year. We will actually meet it by next year. Quite the thing to say, since it's been since 2009. But there's also a deeper question to me, but other than just will they meet it, which I think is still a question, but is that even enough money? I mean, I know $100 billion, I guess, to us is a lot of money, but in terms of what's really necessary?
Eugene, that's a very important question. In fact, $100 billion is supposed to be a seed money that is going to mobilize trillions of dollars. And if I talk about India, where I come from, when it submitted the plan in 2015, the calculations were $2.5 trillion by 2030. And Africa has put forward a plan where they're saying they will be needing $1.3 trillion a year by 2030. And that is the biggest challenge. I think you have hit the nail on its head. If we are not able to mobilize that $100 billion, which was supposed to be a seed money, how will we get trillions? How will we get that transition that is urgently needed? How are we going to protect people from these floods and storms and droughts that we are facing around the world? And they need to prepare for those disasters now, because if we are late in doing that, we will be seeing loss of life, property, and income, which is also happening because we have delayed so much, and it has been 30 years of inaction.
I'm wondering what your reaction has been to seeing the protests that have been going on throughout the summit. They're quite big, people coming from every corner of the globe. What impact has it made on you?
Well, we also joined those protests, and we got really inspired being there, and the kind of voices we got, the messages we got, that have definitely influenced the negotiation. What is missing is urgency. So I would not say that these talks, have not delivered anything. There is progress. There are discussions now, much more about near-term action. For example, as science says, we have to halve the emission by 2030. In the recent US-China announcement focused on that. But we are doing too little, too late. I think that's the main message. And these protests remind us of the urgency that it's coming from ground up. People are rising. People are sending a very strong message to the leaders that this is the time you showed leadership and fix the crisis, because otherwise, for the next few generations, we are going to see devastating impacts people would face for no cause of theirs. And that's not the kind of legacy and heritage we would like to leave behind.
One of the things that I'm curious about, and we talked about this a few times on the show, but I always like to come back to it because I think it's an important point, is possibilities. The New York Times carried a piece today, and it was about the European Union and the burning of biomass and the attempt to promote basically burning wood chips as a green form of fuel. I mean, obviously, the New York Times article was exposing that to some degree, but it seems like one of the issues that really still continues to be pushed by, certainly politicians here in the US and Europe, is the idea that, yes, we need to do something, but we just don't have the right technologies to do something. So ultimately, you have to just bear with us burning a significant amount of dirty fuels until, we develop new technologies. So how do you react to this idea that even though we know we need to change the climate, that we don't technologically have the ability to address it?
The examples that you gave are indications of a much deeper problem. The problem is that our leaders are representing the interest of fossil fuel and other polluting industries, and not of the people who voted for these leaders. And that's the crisis. These climate talks are not climate talks; these are trade talks. And people are coming here, businesses are trying to influence the negotiations so that they don't have to change the way they have been doing their businesses, which has been so damaging for the planet. That's the main crisis. What is needed at this moment is not tinkering or tweaking the way we have been running our economies and societies. We need a total transformation, and leaders are not ready for that. Leaders are still listening to polluters more than people. And that's why they keep putting these, what we label as false solutions. These are not going to help.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the issue of, you're talking about we need a system change. We need, we're not talking about the room when it comes to these international conferences, which is the issue of capitalism, and very closely tied to the issue of capitalism is the issue of militarism. Empire Files' Abby Martin, a very good friend of the show, video of her went viral this week, a couple days ago. I'm sure you saw it, Nancy Pelosi. Why it is that, despite the fact that the Pentagon is responsible for emitting more greenhouse gases than something like 140 countries combined, some crazy number like that. I might not be right about combined, but at least 140 countries, which is just an astonishing figure. why it is that they keep voting for a higher military budget. And then she made a very important point, which is that the issue of military is not even discussed at a gathering like COP26. So, what does it mean if at these international events, which you basically said is more like an event about trade than it is about climate change, but at an international event like this about the most important issue of our time, we're not even discussing the actual causes of climate change? Like, what does it mean for actually tackling this issue if we're just ignoring, not us, but if the people in charge are just ignoring the culprits?
Rania, you are absolutely right. And again, this goes back to the same challenge. What are leaders doing? They are keeping this industry, particularly the whole military industry, as sacrosanct. Let's not even talk about it. We had a similar case with aviation and shipping. Oh, these are beyond national borders. How do we count? And these are ways to just protect the interest. And in case of the US, we know that there are such powerful lobbies and corporations who are not letting any discussion happen on some of these very important issues. The way these industries and military pollutes, and the amount of money they take. We are struggling, and Eugene, as you said, $100 billion. And look at the kind of money goes to military expenditure around the world, and particularly in the US. We are talking about trillions and not billions. And so on one hand, it is cause of the problem, one of the big causes, and at the same time, it's not letting money to go for the right solutions when we have the technology, we know the. So it's really about protecting the interest of a few at the cost of millions and billions. So I think that's exactly what we need to be calling out.
You mentioned it earlier, and I think one of the banner pieces of discussion here has been this US-China agreement to intensify the reduction of emissions. It wasn't super specific, but I think many people, myself included, felt that it was at least welcome to see them talking about cooperating. What do you make of this? I mean, it seems like these are kind of two of the main engines that have to be pulling together if we're going to make change. Is this something that you view as hopeful or what?
No, exactly. We are tired of blame game and finger pointing, and you do first and I'll do later, and I'm concerned about my economy. We are done with it. And look at what it has done to our climate over the last 30 years. It's just inaction and this fighting. We have to move beyond. And that's exactly my analysis. They coming together. What they have put on the table is not enough. I think so. Two things that I liked about the whole thing. They coming together, and second, talking about near term, talking about targets for this decade. Of course, we have to even ramp up those targets and be more specific. But coming together really helps. So the attention goes away from what US and China are talking about each other to what we need to do together to fix the climate crisis. So that's very important at conferences like these.
One other thing that I think seems, important about this and notable about the two countries coming together and talking, about what's going to happen, or let me put it to you like this in a different way. It seems that at the very least, there's a commitment for whatever the final statement is to at least sound serious. And it feels to me that at least from the importance of maybe, let's say, the battle of ideas is absolutely crucial to be able for, those who are campaigning and others to sort of now finally do away with any lingering doubt that this isn't serious and that there doesn't need to be aggressive action. I mean, obviously people will have to be pushed, but it does seem that we've at least come some way, I guess everywhere except the United States Senate, perhaps, in really pushing aside this view that we don't have to do so. I mean, even Saudi Arabia is having conferences saying we have to do something.
Well, that's absolutely true. And not just this announcement we have seen this time has been quite mind-boggling with the number of announcements we heard because of the leader summit that was organized in the first 2 days of this conference. Of course, we would like those announcements to be real and not just for headline-grabbing purposes. If they really turn real, we will be able to do a lot more. We've heard from leaders that they are serious about staying below 1.5 degree, which used to be a debate between 1.5 and 2 degrees, as you know. So we are having a lot more unanimous call for staying below 1.5. We have moved beyond talking about billions, and now trillions are being talked about. But how do we mobilize in reality? And applying the principles of equity and justice are really important, because poor countries who have done least are suffering the most. And one thing that we are fighting for as Climate Action Network is money to help people recover from loss and damage, the impacts that they are facing now. Because it's not about fixing the climate for a distant future. No, we have reached a stage, again, I would say, because of the 30 years of inaction, we have to stay below 1.5 degree. We have to prepare people to deal with climate impacts. And we also have to support people who are already facing the crisis. 30 million new displacements this world has seen in 2020, which was an increase from 24 million the previous year. So that's the scale we are seeing. And if 24 or 30 million people were displaced, imagine how many people wanted to leave their places to earn a living but could not because they were even more vulnerable. So I think we have to understand how we have intensified the crisis over the last few years, and we have to now give them a helping hand and show solidarity.
Mm-hmm. No, and I'm glad you raised that point about equity. I mean, there was a report that came out earlier this week that it was just sort of mind-boggling about the role of the top 1% and the top 10% in accounting for so many of emissions. I mean, the thing that really blew me away is that the bottom 50% of the world could increase their emissions by 200% and still not negatively affect the move towards holding temperatures to 1.5-degree rise, which, I thought on the one hand was a damning statement about global poverty. But I think a critically important statement about the conversation here is that, I mean, it's not even just purely the global north that we're talking about who's putting out many, many more emissions, but really a relatively small slice of the Earth's population that is vastly disproportionately the ones whose lifestyles are so out of control in terms of what we're facing.
Oh, absolutely. We have always known this, and now these studies are making it even more stark for everybody to know. 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of cumulative emissions. And here we are talking about individual action, which is required. But alongside, we first have to target these big emitters, these elites, these big corporations who have caused the problem in the first place. And unless we target them, we will not be able to deal with the problem. And this is where the challenge is, because they are the ones who have most power, and they keep politicians in their pocket. And politicians who come here are protecting the interest of these corporations than people. So the solution is exactly what you were showing. People taking to streets. People are saying, we're watching you and you have to listen to us. Because if you listen to corporations, we will teach you a lesson, by taking your power away. I think that's exactly what is needed now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Harjeet, before we let you go, I mean, I think a lot of people are probably, wondering what to do and listening to what you say and liking it. Where can folks find out more about the work that you all are doing?
So I'm part of Climate Action Network. So you can go to the website climatenetwork.org, or you can follow us on Twitter, CANINTL. And my Twitter handle is @Harjeet11, HARJEET11.
Right on. Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor on Climate Impacts for Climate Action Network International. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Pleasure.
I would say the pleasure is all ours, Rania, but I guess I'm not supposed to say that anymore. But I guess I just did.
I think you should
Can't
rebel
stop
against
me.
this one person. This one person criticized it, and you're
I'm
still
sure
on it.
they're
I
a
think
great
it's awesome.
person. And I don't even really know if they were criticizing it.
I don't
they
think
might
you
have just
mean
been
that.
commenting.
I feel like you don't mean that when you say it. You think
Which
they're
part?
probably
That they're
a great person. The part that I don't think you mean that.
I do
I
mean
really
that.
don't. I don't think you'd still be on it.
I want the person to
it's
appear
been like
again in the
months.
chat so I can congratulate them for being a great person.
Eugene
What if
is
they
like
never
calling on
watched
this
again
person.
because they didn't like how much pleasure I was taking in our guests? But what do you want me to say? It is our pleasure. People are working hard. They got a lot going on. I really
I agree
appreciate
with
people
you.
giving them their time. Rania, we got
I
a
agree
lot of
with you.
super chats out there.
Yeah,
I read a lot
did.
and I thought that was it, but it wasn't.
No.
There's a long list.
Like,
I
where did
mean,
we end?
it's really
I
amazing.
think, you know, I think what it speaks to is people are like really desperate to hear about Ethiopia in a way that's like real and not
Yeah.
just propagandistic. And so clearly there's just like an outpouring of support for the sort of coverage they're not getting anywhere else.
Yeah, no, well,
y-
I can run through a bunch. And
I
you
mean,
know, go ahead.
I go for it. I actually don't know where we stopped. I'm looking at this list and I'm like, where did we even end?
Thankfully,
Like,
I was paying attention.
you
So I
were.
do know Jonas,
Ooh,
shout out to you.
that was a bird.
Barish,
That was a bird.
Solomon, Erie Forever. It's a good handle. Shout out to Eritrea. Marisha, Mina, someone whose name is in Amharics, but shout out to you nonetheless. Kay, Nate, Chemo, Beto, Caleb, Mateo, The One. Okay, a little Matrix solution there, perhaps.
Yeah.
EE, Andy, Bahru, Amare, Jared, Asafa, Massimiliano, Eli, Mr. Geb 2009, Brahanu, Chu, Shumate, Afghan, and another Solomon. Maybe the same Solomon. There's a couple people who donated
It might
a couple
be.
times, but shout out
It's
to
possible.
you either way if you did it once or twice. So that's a relatively long list. It's like 40 people on there, but everyone who donated in the super chat, we really, really appreciate you for participating, for watching, and for everyone else who has participated and watched in really any way, shape, or form. It's a good reminder. You can always go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can become a patron there. Your ongoing support would be deeply supported. The ongoing support of our existing patrons is very deeply supported. You can also go to breakthroughnews.org and make a
Did we
one-time donation if
forget
you
to
like.
make an announcement, by the way? Speaking of patrons, I think there was an announcement we were going to
was.
make, and then the show got a little shifted around.
It
Maybe
did.
now's a good time to
It's
do
that
that.
if you become a patron, you will be able to have exclusive access to the podcast version of the Freedom Side, which is exactly what you just saw, except minus the video. So you have the option to get the Freedom Side as a podcast. A lot of people have been asking us about this. Where is the Freedom Side as a podcast? Will you provide the Freedom Side as a podcast? Well, America
We will.
and the world, your long national nightmare or global nightmare is over. The Freedom Side is available as a podcast, but only for those who are patrons. So go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron, and you too can have access to the podcast version of the Freedom Side.
Yeah, some people just like to listen. It's cool. Like some people don't want to watch.
You're moving around,
Yeah.
you're cooking dinner, whatever
In
it
the
may
car,
be, driving.
working
Yes,
out.
Many reasons. Well, Rania, I think that brings us more or less to the end of it here today. As always, it's my pleasure to be here alongside you, co-hosting the Freedom Side, and we will see you all again next week.